Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Jen with Sloat Garden Center. Welcome to our second virtual class. I'm really excited about today's class on composting and soil health basics with Charlotte Canner. I wanted to go over a little bit of housekeeping while people are still signing in. Um, First of all, I really appreciate all the feedback that everybody's providing on this webinar format. It's a new format and I'm just getting used to it and we're getting used to it. So I really appreciate any feedback you have for it. We really want to make it an effective experience for you and fun and whatnot. And so we're looking at adding different times and different days and all kinds of stuff. So please feel free to email me any feedback. There are some handouts for this webinar that you should have received with your reminder email that you got an hour before this started. So hopefully you can access that. If not, I will drop a link in the chat. They're on our website on our blog. So there's an outline there and a resource handout. So that's great. Also, if you could please take a moment to fill out the poll. You can fill it out now while we're getting going. And then there's also a follow-up survey at the end. Again, we're trying to get as much information as possible. So the more you can let us know, the better. And then the Q&A portion, if you have any questions, drop it into the Q&A and we'll try to answer as much as possible. One of the things we learned from the last class is that we're not going to take a ton of time during the presentation for Q&A. We'll pause and take a couple questions here and there, but we're going to reserve most of the questions to the end of the class. So keep on feeding them in and we'll try to get to as much as possible, if not during the class, then by the end of the class. Okay, so getting to our presentation, I'm not sure how many of you attended last class, but if you did, you're in for kind of a package deal for this class because we have Suzanne back from last week and she's gonna help filter questions for Charlotte, and really looking forward to Charlotte's presentation. Like I said, it's on composting and soil health basics. It's a super important component to getting your garden ready for spring. And so without further ado, I welcome Charlotte. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks everyone for being here, and thanks for Sloat Gardens for hosting today. And thank you for spending your Saturday morning with me. My name's Charlotte Canner. You can see my information down there. I have been a lifelong composter thanks to my mom, but I really got into composting and gardening about in 2015. I took a class at the Garden for the Environment. It was a 3-month course called Get Up, which is a organic gardening and compost educator class. So I learned how to compost and how to garden, but I also learned how to teach it. And that really jump-started my excitement for composting and soil health. And now I work as an IPM advocate for Our Water, Our World, and as a compost educator, and also as a maintenance gardener in San Francisco. So here's our agenda, and you have the outline as well with a little bit more detail. I'm going to be talking for about an hour, probably a little bit over an hour, and I'm going to stop about twice within the presentation. So if there's anything that I'm covering that either you want elaboration on or just doesn't make sense, you want clarification, at those points, I'm happy to answer those questions. I'm going to ask that, while you can shoot out your questions really at any time, most of the general questions, if they're not answered in the presentation, I'm going to answer those at the end of class in the Q&A. So first, a little bit about our Water Our World, and you might know this if you were here last week with Suzanne, but just a review for everyone. Our Water Our World is a program designed to bring awareness between pesticides and water quality and provide pest problem-solving education. You can find our Water Our World materials in 200 hardware stores and nurseries in 23 counties in California. And in most of the stores, what you'll see is in the pesticide aisle, you'll see this rack that you can see on the left with information about different pests and other issues in the garden, free to take if you see them. And then you'll also see shelf talkers, these little blue signs that you can see on the bottom middle. Those highlight the products on the shelf that are less toxic and eco-friendly and less toxic to waterways. And you can get all of the fact sheets, all the locations of stores that we partner with, and a list of less toxic products on the Our Water Our World website. That's ourwaterourworld.org. So now I am going to be talking about soil and composting today, but I'm an IPM, integrated pest management advocate. So we're always thinking about pest management, and I'm going to show you how soil will lead to less pests. So we're going to start with what is IPM. And integrated pest management is a decision-making process. It's a science-based approach that looks at the system or the environment as a whole. It identifies what is the problem. Sometimes when we see a pest, we just go right at the pest, but we really want to step back and think about what's really going on and how we can change maybe the environment to make sure that pest doesn't come back. And when we do have pests, we want to decide, can we live with it? Some pests are short-lived, and so maybe we can just kind of wait it out. But some cause a lot of damage, and we're going to need to take some action to get rid of them. And when we do take action, there's certain steps that we take that we call controls. And there's cultural controls, which is bolstering the health of the garden. That's what really we're going to focus on today. It's creating a good environment for your plants and a bad environment for pests. And mechanical controls, also physical controls. These are the tools and the barriers that we can use in the garden. Fencing, weeding tools, weed whackers, row cover, mulch, barriers, physical things that we can do in the garden. Then there's biological controls, which is inviting in beneficial insects. And then lastly, last and least, we have chemical controls, which would be pesticides. And we're always using those as a last resort, always eco-friendly, the least toxic as possible, and as little as possible. And then just to give you another idea of what IPM is, and how we think about our controls, prevention is really the foundation of IPM. So we take a lot of steps to prevent pests from coming in. And among these is building healthy garden, healthy soil. So prevention and cultural control, this is a lot where our soil comes in, and we're going to talk about that today. So the thesis of the day, that you probably have already guessed, is when you increase the health of your soil, you're reducing pest problems. Healthy soil equals healthy plants equals less pest problems. When plants are not stressed, they're getting the nutrients and the water that they need consistently, they'll be less attractive to pests, and healthy plants can endure pest issues if they do arise, so you won't need to use pesticides. So we're going to talk about soil, but to give everyone a good understanding, get everyone on the same page, I'm just going to review a few key ideas about soil just so we understand what's going on. So what's soil made out of? It's about 45% mineral particles, 25% water, 25% air, and about 5% organic matter. And the organic matter is the key that we're going to really focus on. And 5% organic matter is really just an average of what good soil is, that's quote unquote good soil. However, it can go up to 10%, 15, even 20%. That's like really, really amazing fertile soil. It doesn't really go much further than that. But it can go way down. So for example, many years ago, I'm sorry, I don't know how many years ago, but a long time ago, the soil in the California Central Valley, where most of the farms in California are located, um, used to be at 10% organic matter. And now, after years and years and years of tilling, growing, plowing, pesticide usage, now it's down to 1% organic matter. So we're going to learn how to boost that organic matter levels and why that's important. Some other terms: soil texture. You might have heard the question, like, what kind of soil do you have? And that's really asking, do you have sand, silt, clay, or a mixture of the three? So sand, if you're like me on the western half of San Francisco, or where Sloat is on Sloat Boulevard, this area used to be all dunes. So we have a lot of sandy soil out here, which means the particles are really large. You can see them in your hand, and there's a lot of pore spaces, so the water and the air can enter, but water can also move really quickly through it as well. If you live more on a hill area, especially in San Francisco, the hills have clay soil. Clay is like teeny tiny microscopic particles. They're kind of flat usually, so they're really tightly packed, and there's very little space between them for air and water to infiltrate. Or you might have something in the middle, which is silt, medium-sized particles and medium-sized pore spaces. And then you could also have a mixture of all three. Whatever is like larger, that's kind of the soil type you have, or the more prominent, that's the soil texture you have, sorry about that. And then soil structure is how all of these particles are put together. So how it is the particles, the organic matter, the air, and the water, how all of these components are put together. And good soil structure, it means that there are pore spaces, that the particles hold together tightly into to form aggregates. And that image right there just is a demonstration of what healthy soil structure looks like. It's gluey, it sticks together, but there's still pore spaces allowed for worms, organisms, air, water, all that, roots to move through. And our last term in the soil basics lesson here is photosynthesis, which I'm sure we've all heard of, but just in case we don't remember our 8th grade science, I just wanted to review it for you. Photosynthesis is the process in which plants take carbon dioxide from the air, water from the soil, and they use the sun's energy to turn it into oxygen, which they release into the air, and then they turn it into sugar or carbohydrates, and those carbohydrates get used to build their own structure. So it's the roots, the stem, the leaves, the fruits, the flowers, all of that is made out of carbohydrates or sugar that they make. But it's often thought that roots are like straws. They just kind of suck up water and nutrients from the soil. But we've actually learned that they're not actually straws. They don't just take, they also give. So a lot of plants and trees share 20 to 80% of the carbohydrates that they create through photosynthesis. They actually pump it down into the soil, and they share it with soil organisms. And it's really important to understand this exchange because it shows how important bacteria, fungi, and vertebrates, all the life in the soil, is vital for our plants. Our plants cannot live without this life in the soil. Think about your stomach, basically your gut. Humans can't digest food without the gut microbiome. So there's bacteria in your gut that helps digest the food, breaks it down so that your body can absorb it. The same exact thing is happening in your soil. So plants can't just, consume the organic matter as it is in the soil. It needs help from the bacteria and the fungi, the invertebrates in the soil. So this exchange, the plants are pumping down carbohydrates into the soil to feed the soil organisms. And in exchange, the bacteria and the fungi are feeding the plant the nutrients and the water that it needs. So we really want to nurture this life because, again, our plants can't live without it. And we really need to remember that when we're taking care of our plants, we should be taking care of the soil organisms as well. And we're going to talk about how today. So what is healthy soil? It has high levels of organic matter, also called carbon. Carbon is organic matter. It's alive. It has fungus, bacteria, and vertebrates. It has good water infiltration. So that means water, when it rains or there's a storm event, water can sink down into the soil because there's pores for it to enter. It acts like a sponge, and it doesn't just rush off the surface of the soil. There's high water holding capacity. That means water holding capacity is the ability of the soil, the ability of the soil to absorb and store water without getting oversaturated. So we have a high water holding capacity. Healthy soil also filters out toxins. So like I said, it has high levels of organic matter, which is carbon. And carbon is actually, it acts like a Brita filter. So not to, brand name drop, but in those water filters, the filter is actually made out of carbon. And so when water goes into the soil, the same thing is happening in your soil. The carbon or the organic matter in the soil is filtering out the toxins so that when it reaches deep down in the aquifers, it's fresh, clean water. Healthy soil delivers nutrients and water to plants when they need it. The plants are communicating with the soil organisms, and the soil organisms are delivering the micronutrients, all of the diverse amount of nutrients in the soil to the plant as they need it, as opposed to being hit with some crazy chemical fertilizer that's just shooting nitrogen at the plant when they don't necessarily need it. That causes stress to the plant. So healthy soil will deliver plants when they need it for consistent, steady growth. And for this reason, healthy soil doesn't require chemical fertilizers and pesticides. And this is for many reasons that we're going to repeat a lot today. It's getting the nutrients that it needs. So we don't need to throw crazy high intensity fertilizers at it. And it doesn't require pesticides because healthy, slow growing plants will be able to fend off pest infestations when they do arrive. And they're not as attractive to pests as well. So how do we make our soil healthy? What we're going to talk about today is we're going to use compost, we're going to use mulch, we're going to use organic fertilizers, and we're going to go over what and why for each of these today. We're going to water appropriately, and we're going to avoid pesticides. Overall, we're just encouraging life and diversity both above and below the soil. So diverse plants in your garden are going to invite lots of good bugs, beneficial insects that will also help you tackle pests. And it will encourage diversity in the bacteria and the fungi below the soil because they're feeding the soil different things. Diversity above and below the soil is what we need for healthy gardens. So compost is our first step. What is compost? It's nature's way of recycling nutrients and materials. It's the decomposition of organic matter into a usable form. And that final decomposed matter is compost. And just a reminder, it's not soil. We just learned that soil is the 4 ingredients of mineral particles, organic matter, air, and water. Compost is not soil, it's part of soil. And why is compost so wonderful? Well, it improves soil health, and it improves the soil health in a lot of ways. And most importantly, I would say it improves the soil structure. So when you do have sandy soil and you add compost to it, it's really gluing the particles together because compost has organic matter. It is organic matter. It's very gluey. The bacteria and the fungi in it create a sticky substance that will help glue the particles together so that when water hits your sandy soil, it doesn't just rush through. It stays and it's held there. On the other spectrum, if you have clay soil and you add compost to it, it's basically breaking up the particles to add pore spaces so that water and air can infiltrate. So it helps both extremes of your soil structure just be healthier and more better for your plants. And for this reason, it increases water retention in the soil. Compost can hold 5 times its weight in water. So when you're adding it to the soil, you're adding this spongy quality to your soils that can hold water for long periods of time, which is helpful, especially in California when we have rainy winters and drier summers. It will hold on to water deep into the dry summer. It increases the microbiology in the soil, which, as we already discussed, that's most important. So compost is super rich in microbiology. So it inoculates. Sorry, that's the word I was looking for. It inoculates your soil with all that extra biology. It balances pH levels. The bacteria and all the soil organisms do this. They kind of level each other out. This is a little bit more sciencey than I can explain, but adding compost to your soil will balance the pH level so you don't have to add any other materials to it. Recycles nutrients, so it's taking nutrients from organic matter that was already existed, your fruit scraps, your yard waste, and it puts it back into the earth. And for this reason, we're reducing the need for chemical fertilizers and pesticides. Again, this healthy soil will lead to healthy plants, no pesticides needed. And it actually fights pathogens and bad bacteria in the soil. So that intense microbiology, that diverse microbiology in the soil actually can help fight off bad bacteria or diseases that come in contact or close to your roots. And I've actually read that fungus can actually act as like a shield for your roots to protect it from pathogens in soil, which is pretty amazing. So we'll pause there for questions. If anything there doesn't make sense or need elaborating on, I can try to answer your questions.
Charlotte, great job. I'm so excited. I'm already learning so much. I'm going through some of the questions people are asking, and so far, I know that you're going to be addressing some of the answers. So, and a couple of the topics are going to get covered in the next section. So I would, if there's only one question that might be relevant, and it's funny because I just learned about this yesterday. Someone is asking, how does biochar work? Is this something that you can talk about? Because it could work, it could fit in right now.
Biochar, that is a hot word. I've heard a lot about it, and I will admit I can't talk too much about it, but I know it's like adding activated carbon, I believe, to your soil, which is, again, carbon in the soil is good. But you know what? That person who asked that question, feel free to email me and I'm going to do some research and I'm happy to get back to you because I want to learn more about it as well.
Yeah, cool. It is fun. Yeah, I'm just learning about it myself. So really great question. Okay, there are a couple more questions that are coming in, but because I know the content that's coming up, let's wait to the next pause. Thanks, Charlotte.
Okay, great. Thanks, Suzanne. So now let's talk about making compost, the fun part. So when we are making compost, we as composters, it's a reminder, it's a natural process. So what composting is, it's just decomposition. It happens on the forest floor. It happens all over all the time. But as composters, what we're doing is just helping speed up the process. And we do this by chopping materials into smaller pieces, building a container and an environment for the compost, and then we monitor the conditions. I like to make the metaphor that we're like hosts of a party. We are we're supplying the food, the drink, the venue for the microbiology to like have a really great time. And for our food, our 5 main ingredients are nitrogen, which we also call greens, carbon, which we can call browns, water, air, and of course we want to invite the microbiology. I know a lot of times if you read about making compost, you'll see this number, the carbon to nitrogen ratio that's recommended for composting is 30:1. But I don't want you to hang on to that number because it's kind of confusing and it's really hard to measure that. So just really understanding what your materials are. I would suggest if you are making a compost pile, just start with layering your greens and your browns, your nitrogen, your carbon evenly. And then as you go, you'll be able to adjust accordingly. And it's, again, I don't want you to hang on to that number because I still don't totally understand it. Because every material has both nitrogen and carbon in it, but just different ratios. So start out just layering evenly and then watching and monitoring the conditions. And then for moisture, we want to make sure it's as moist as a wrung out sponge. So for our greens, our nitrogen heavy materials are green leaves, lawn clippings, fruit and vegetable trimmings. And then while manure and coffee grounds are not green, they are considered greens because they are high in nitrogen. So cow, horse, rabbit, and poultry manure. We're not using pet feces, no cat and dog feces that contains bacteria that we do not want in our compost pile. So we're just focused on cow manure, horse manure, rabbit, and then either chicken, duck manure is healthy. At the Garden for the Environment, they actually use pigeon manure, but it's not like urban pigeons. They're not just like picking up pigeon manure off the street. They're using, they have a neighbor that raises racing pigeons. So they have nice healthy diet. And he brings it to the Garden for the Environment. And it's really great for their compost. Cow and horse manure, especially horse manure, is actually really great because it has a wonderful balance of the carbon and the nitrogen, because usually it's pulled from the horse stalls where there's maybe a bedding of straw or sawdust and it's already mixed in. So that's really great if you can get access to that fresh horse manure. Coffee grounds and filters. The filters are usually made of paper, so they're carbon. So that's, again, another balanced ingredient. And then on the other side, carbon or browns are more the drier materials. So dry dead leaves, woody twigs and branches, untreated sawdust, making sure there's no paint materials or any treatment in that wood, straw, newspaper, and cardboard. And I'm going to preemptively answer a question because I've gotten this question several times before when using newspaper. Most newspapers, at least in California, I think across the US, mainstream newspapers, I guess, do use like a soy ink. So it is fine to use newspaper in your compost, and you don't have to worry about the ink. But if you're concerned, you can probably easily check with your individual, especially like a local newspaper, what they use. And then we're going to also talk about choosing a compost system. I'm going to go through 3 types of systems that are like the main types. There are different ways to compost that I'm going to talk about today, but just the 3 main types that we're going to view. And I'm going to tell you a little bit how to make it with each system, and then what things to keep in mind if you decide to go with that system. So I want you to think about a few factors: the space that you have in your yard or your home, the materials that you want to put in it, and then the time and effort that you want to put in it. So we'll start with the hot, active, or 3-bin system. It's just 3 names to call the same thing. This is the 3-bin system at the Garden for the Environment. And it's called hot compost system because the activity of the microbiology gets so high that they create their own heat. We're not adding heat to the compost, it's heating itself just from the bacteria and the fungi, everything moving around, eating, reproducing, that creates the heat. It's called active just because of the activity of the microbiology in the pile. Also called active because we as composters have a much more active role in the 3-bin system. So we have to do a little bit more in this system to make sure that the compost is nice and hot. And I should note that hot, when I say hot, it can get up to over 160 degrees sometimes if done right. And then 3-bin system, it usually has this 3-bin. This is just the optimal space and for quick movement of pile from one to the next. And I'm going to talk really briefly about that, but if you have specific questions about the 3-bin system, I'll either answer them later or you can shoot me an email. So really quick overview on how to work with the 3-bin system is first, you're going to chop materials. The more chopping, faster the decomposition. So you really want to chop everything you put in 1-inch pieces or smaller. And if you have trouble chopping or they're like bigger than your pinky, that's probably too big for the compost pile. So you want to probably put that in the green bin. And then you're going to build your material in bin 1. So you're layering your greens and your browns as evenly as possible, making sure that you're watering and adding moisture as needed. And you're going to add manure or finished compost, or you can add the, I think it's EB Stone compost maker. All of these 3 things are meant to inoculate your compost with the good bacteria that we want. So manure, finished compost, compost maker all has that, that bacteria in it. So we're putting that into the compost to really start things going. We're going to monitor the temperature and then add materials, water, aerate if necessary. Aerating is usually when you pull out the compost bin, out of the bin and then putting it back in. It's as easy as that. You can water it while you do that if needed. So with the hot compost bin, usually in bin 2 is the where the party gets started, as I say. Like that's where really a lot of the decomposition happens in the middle bin. That's where the bacteria is really active, eating a lot, moving around a lot, reproducing. And the temperature is going to have some peaks, so it's going to go up a lot, and then it might come down. And when it comes down, you want to aerate it, turn it, check the moisture levels. Is it moist? Does it smell good? Does it smell bad? If it smells bad, that means you need to aerate it or add some more brown materials. You definitely don't want to be able to smell your compost or have a bad smell to it. So your temperature is going to go up and down a lot as you are monitoring it and aerating it. And then once it consistently comes down, that usually means it's close to finished. And it'll look more like the photo on the bottom left, where the pieces are all brown and they're unrecognizable. They're just kind of sticks and you can't really tell what they were. That means that your compost is pretty much done. And what you want to do is you want to sift the materials. Again, this is how much effort you want to put into this. Sift the materials, which will just make it easier to use. So the material that gets sifted through is nice fine compost material that can be added to your beds and added to your pots for use. And then the sticks, the kind of rougher material that's left on top of the sifter is can be used like as a compost, as a really nutrient dense mulch. And we'll get into mulch later, but it can really just add a lot of nutrients just by layering it on top of the soil. And then a hot bin can heat up to over 160 degrees if done right. So if you want to choose this system, a few things to think about. It does require a large area. You really, the 3-bin system is very quick. So the 3 bins are set up to move things quickly along. So you really want 3 bins, minimum each bin 3 by 3 by 3. So it will take up a lot of space. You want to be able to access a lot of yard debris because you really want to fill that first bin quickly. The faster you fill it, the faster the decomposition will start. Food scraps are not recommended for this system, only yard waste. It will require time for chopping, moving, aerating, and sifting the material. So this I'm going to say very hesitantly. Some hot bins can heat up hot enough to kill weed seeds and diseased plant material, But for backyard bins, especially when just starting out, I really recommend not putting any weed seeds or diseased plant material in your bin. It's just going to make your life easier if you don't, because you don't have to worry about getting it hot enough to kill that, and you don't have to worry about accidentally introducing weeds to your garden beds. And it's going to supply a lot of compost in 2 to 4 months. So depending on the conditions, both like of the climate and how fast, good you're monitoring the material and how fast it's going, it could be 2 to 4 months and you'll get a whole bin of compost. So it's a lot of compost pretty quickly. So we're going to move on to our single bin system, also called cold or a passive, or it's also just a pile. It's as simple as that. So cold because it doesn't get as much activity, so it doesn't quite get as hot. It can get warm for sure, but it won't get quite as hot as a hot bin. Passive because you really don't need to put a lot of energy into the system. Us as composters, this is really as close to like the natural process as it gets. You can just literally throw your garden debris in a pile and just kind of let nature do her thing. But of course, if you want to speed up the process, you can take some actions to make it go faster. And then you can have a single bin in a lot of different forms. You can buy the store-bought one that sits just right on the ground, like the one on the left, or a tumbler on the right, or you can do a DIY version like the one with pallets or fencing. Or you can have a compost pile. I don't recommend just the pile if you live in an urban environment. It can get messy and attract urban critters and just probably cause more nuisance than it's worth. So definitely, if you're in an urban environment, a contained one would be better. So how to with a single bin system? As I said, you can really just throw things in a pile and let nature do her thing. Or you can speed it up, and same idea with a 3-bin system. You're speeding it up by chopping the materials. You're adding manure or another kind of inoculation like compost or compost maker. And then you're monitoring the conditions, make sure it's moist and aerating it if necessary. And so if you want to wait for the whole bin to decompose, it's probably going to take 6 to 12 months. But if you want just a little bit of compost at a time, you can pull from the bottom, either with this kind of bin. They have like doors on the bottom that you can pull up and just pull from the bottom. Or you can, if you have a pile even, you can just kind of lift up the material and pull from the bottom. That's where the most decomposed matter will be. And you can sift it if you want. It just makes it easier to work with. And now, also hesitantly, I'm going to say that you can add fruit and vegetable scraps to a single bin system if you wish, but you really need to make sure that your bin is very secure. So it has a really tight lid. It has hardware cloth, whatever, it depends on how you're making it, but you really don't want to attract rats or raccoons or other urban critters. And ways to do that are to bury the food scraps deep in your pile. And then you don't want it to go anaerobic either. So you really want to make sure you're monitoring it. And when you do add food scraps, you also want to add a carbon material like a dry leaves to balance it out. So I would recommend not adding food and vegetable scraps to start. And then as you get more comfortable with compost, maybe try to add a little bit if you wish, and just be very careful and monitor closely. If you want to choose a single bin system, it is smaller than the 3-bin system, but it will take some space. It can be filled slowly, so you don't need as much yard waste all at once. You can just kind of add as you go. And it also kind of requires almost no effort if you don't want to put any effort into it. But of course, you can put more effort and it will just speed up the process. And it will not get hot enough to kill weed seeds or diseases. And as I said, it could take 6 to 12 months, but you can use small amounts from the bottom as it breaks down. And then our third system that we're going to talk about today, which I know is a popular one, is worm bins or vermicomposting. So worm composting is really having your worms, these specific type of worm that we're going to talk about in a second, feeding them food scraps, and then we harvest their castings, or which is a fancy word for their poop. So that their castings or poop is the compost that we're going to add to our gardens. That's the compost. And so worm composting can be DIY, like the Rubbermaid on the top left, just with some air holes, or it can be store-bought, the Worm Cafe, the black one with the layers. That's available at Sloat. That's similar to the one I have. I like the layers. Wood one that you could buy, or this industrial one on the bottom right is made out of, that's made by Common Compost, a company in Oakland that supplies or sells big industrial sized worm bins to HOAs or community centers, places that provide a lot of food waste. And so a how-to with your worm bin, we want to create a dark, moist environment with air. So worms really, they need moisture, they like darkness, and they need oxygen. So whatever container you put it in, just make sure there's air holes and it's dark. So to start, we're going to add a bedding. So that's usually of a carbon material, either shredded newspaper or coconut coir, which is a coconut husk kind of shredded up. You can buy it in a brick form. They do sell it at Sloat. You can buy it in a brick form that's like really compacted. You put it in water and it expands huge. And that actually acts as a really nice bedding for worms. So then you have your bedding, then you add food. You're going to add I recommend people new to the worm bin, with new worm bins, I recommend raw vegan scraps only. You can use coffee grounds and tea as well. And then the only non-vegan thing to add would be eggshells crushed up, because worms need a little bit of grit to properly digest their food. You can, if you don't have access to eggshells or you don't want to use eggshells, you can use a pinch or two of dirt or sand, something that they just helps them. It's just the way they digest. They need some kind of mineral dirt or grit material to help digest. But definitely raw scraps, nothing oily, nothing cooked, no meat, no dairy. And we want to avoid too much citrus, too much onion, garlic, scallion, leek, the allium, anything in the allium family. They can handle some of it, but just not too much. Same with citrus. The oils in both of those kinds of foods just irritate them if there's too much of it. And then again, same with 3-bin system or single bin system. The more the food is chopped, the faster they're going to eat it. So I've even seen someone feed their worms like a smoothie, basically putting all their food scraps in a food processor or a blender and just blending it. Those worms ate so fast. It was really amazing. But again, you don't have to. You can just put whole, banana peels in there as well. It's just going to be a little bit slower. And then after you add the food, you're going to add your worms. And we're going to use the species Eisenia fetida, which are also called red wigglers. And you can purchase these from hardware stores or nurseries, so it does have them. And this is the specific type we want to use. I would recommend starting with about 1,000 worms, which is about a pound. Because worms will eat half their body weight in a day. So a pound of worms will eat a half a pound of food a day. So keep this in mind when you're starting your worm bin. You don't want to overfeed them. Don't worry too much about underfeeding them. They can subsist on less, and they can also eat just like the material already in their bedding if needed. But you don't want to overload them, or else you're going to get, it's going to go either anaerobic, you're going to attract flies and other critters that you don't want. The optimal temperature for worms is 40 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. 60 degrees, or San Francisco Bay Area weather, is optimal. Well, I guess San Francisco only, sorry, is optimal for worms. But they can live in colder and warmer temperatures. If you live in an area that gets hotter, like the Contra Costa or Marin, excuse me. Hold on one second. If you do live in climates that get much hotter than that, you might want to consider bringing your worms inside or into a garage if that's a little bit more tolerable temperature wise. You can keep your worm bin inside. I know people who do that. And it's just it's actually great because you can monitor them easily. They're inside with you. You just want to make sure that you are, making sure you're not overfeeding because you don't want to attract too many flies, which can get a little yucky inside. And then really quick on harvesting, I can elaborate if people have questions, but harvesting your worms, your worm castings, the castings for composting. There's a few ways to do it, and it depends on what kind of system you have. So if you have a layered bin like the Worm Cafe, and you have your worms, your finished bin, a nice bin full of finished material, which is kind of like the bottom right picture. There's no more recognizable food in there. They've eaten it all, they've processed it. It's a nice full bin. You want to draw them out of that layer, and you can do that by either lifting the lid off of the bin so that the light will push them down into the layer below, or you can just start feeding them in the layer below, and they will go down to where the food is. And then if you have a single layer bin, like the Rubbermaid version, you can just start feeding them on one side of the bin, and eventually they'll be drawn out of the compost and go to where the food is. And don't worry about, if you're harvesting your worm castings and a few of your worms get stuck in it and they end up going into your flower beds or your pots, that's totally fine. They like to live in there as well. And a finished compost, at least to start, is about 6 months. Again, depends on how much food you're feeding them, how many worms you have. But it is definitely a little bit of a longer process than a hot bin system. So if you want to choose a worm bin, keep in mind they can be stored inside or outside, keeping mindful of temperature. They only use food scraps, so raw vegan food scraps and eggshells to start. Usually I say no yard waste, though I will say I was corrected at a webinar last week. Someone said, yes, you can use yard waste, but I'm going to say, yes, if you have a little bit of green grass clippings or a couple of handfuls of leaves, yes, you can put that in your worm bin. But my hesitation is that there's just so much yard waste and only such a small space for the worms that they really need, that you can't overfill them, or they're not going to be able to eat it all before it goes, before it starts to rot. So just be really mindful. I would definitely just start with the food scraps. But worms do eat yard waste out in the world, so feeding them leaves is not going to kill them. It's just more about the amount that you have in your bin. Some effort is required, mostly just to start it up. But generally they just kind of eat, they do their thing. And as long as there's not too much food, you'll be in pretty good shape. And then you'll get usable vermicompost in 3 to 6 months, again, depending on the conditions. And it's great for kids. So if you have kids, they love poking around in the worm bin and seeing all the little critters in there. So using compost, there's a few ways to use it. When you have your finished compost, you can mix it into soil when you're preparing a bed or a pot for a new planting. That's called amending the soil. So we're adding this beautiful organic matter to our soil to really give it that, that gluey, nutrient-rich texture that we want in our healthy soil. If you have existing plantings and you want to just give them a little nutrient boost, you can add it to the soil surface or dig it into the top inch of the soil and then water it in. You can also do this. This is a great time to add compost around your trees and shrubs in the winter when hopefully it's going to continue raining. You can add it around the soil surface at the drip line of your trees. So that's the outer edge of the branches where the water drips off in the rain. You can add compost to that area, and so when the rain does come, it'll water all those nutrients down into the soil. You can also make a compost tea. And the compost tea, it's very much sounds like it is what it sounds like. It's, you know, a tea bag or like a sock or some sort of bag that has compost in it, soaked in water, either aerated or used very quickly. And that tea, that really nutrient dense, that life dense water can be used as a soil inoculation to add those the soil organisms or the organisms to your soil. It can be used as a fertilizer because it's very nutrient dense, or it can be used as a foliar spray, which is a spray that goes on the leaves and the stem and the branches of a plant. And that's often used as a preventative for to prevent pests like aphids. It just prevents, it helps your plant fight off pests if needed. Compost tea can be very technical, so I'm not going to go too much into it. If you're interested in making compost tea, I would definitely read up on it because there are some things, some nuances to it, like aerating and what kind of water you want to use. I'm far from an expert. I'll show you just this quick clip. This is at home. I've made some compost tea, and honestly, now I'm starting to doubt if I did it right. But it's just a sock with compost in it and a little aquarium pump. Just pump some air into it to keep it from going anaerobic. And I use that within 24 hours of soaking. So some quick troubleshooting. If your compost is smelly, that usually means it turned anaerobic, and it could turn anaerobic for a few reasons. It's just probably too moist. So aerating it, turning the pile, adding more carbon materials like dry leaves, newspaper, wood shavings. If we're talking about a worm bin, that's just probably you have too much food, they're not eating it fast enough. So maybe remove some of the food and turn it a little bit and add some more carbon to it to balance things out. If it's attracting flies, rodents, or urban critters, that's also probably because they're attracted to food scraps. So if you have a single bin system, I would just either turn the pile, add carbons, add manure or finished compost to really increase the microbiology in it to break it down faster. You could bury the food deeper, or just remove the food scraps altogether. That will really eliminate the problem. And if you are attracting rodents or other urban critters, just make sure that you're not using meat and dairy, putting meat and dairy in the bin, and you're securing your bin with a 1/4-inch hardware cloth so that the rodents can't get in. If the material is not breaking down, that probably just means there's not enough life in it. So you really want to check the moisture levels because the microbiology is not going to be active without enough moisture. And then you can add a manure compost or a compost maker to really increase that microbiology. Questions on that? I bet there are.
Oh, yeah, we do have a wonderful assortment of questions. Backing up, a couple people have asked, how do you get compost into the soil? And with that, if you have a large area, like a big backyard, that the soil is kind of old and it's not very nutrient rich,
Mhm.
how what's the best way to get soil or these nutrients in that environment also? So it's kind of a two-part question.
Okay, well, let's see. Let's start with on the smaller scale. If you're just preparing a smaller area for planting, just digging in. So you're gonna just layer maybe, again, it depends on how much area, but probably an inch or two of compost on top of the area, and then just use a shovel to dig it in. You really want it in the top 6 to 8 inches or so of the soil. Just using a shovel to just dig it in and turn your soil over to really mix it in. I've heard that it's recommended if you are planting to try to add your compost like a month or a couple weeks ahead of planting. So it really gives the compost opportunity to really integrate into that soil and build that soil up and get healthier before it's ready for planting. If you're thinking about a large scale, you could do the same thing. It would require a lot more work. We're going to talk about this method called sheet mulching later. That could be an option for a large yard. It will just take more time, but you'll have really rich soil. And that just quickly, although we're going to go over it later, it's just really layering compost, cardboard, mulch, compost, and then letting it break down and really just infiltrate your soil to really regenerate that soil. I think that's my answer for now. And if there's follow-up, please send me.
And then a lot of people have asked about using eggshells in the compost bin. I know you mentioned it's good for the worm bin, but folks are asking about the either the 3-bin active thermal composting or passive composting.
Again, I wouldn't recommend it in the 3-bin system. That really should just be strictly for yard waste. I think broken down in the single bin would be fine. I've heard that it's actually good for your soil just to crush up eggshells and mix it into your soil as is and let the biology in your soil just break it down there as well. This is kind of a DIY, I probably shouldn't say this, but like sometimes it can help with dealing with like snails and other pests in the garden as well. But yeah, I would just break it down, like crush them before you put them in the single bin or the worm bin. But again, I would keep them out of the 3-bin system.
Okay, super. I'm just going to ask one more question, and then we can keep moving. There's a lot we can still answer after the program, but I know there's some more great content you're going to cover. A lot of people are asking about how to manage the worm bins outside when we don't live in San Francisco, because outside of San Francisco, we actually get hot days and we get really cold days. So how do we manage the worms outside when we have extreme temperatures? And also, where's the best place to have the worm bin outside? Would it be like under a shady tree near the house, under a carport? That has also come up. And then after your answer, we'll just keep moving.
Great. Though that's a great question. Fortunately, the worm bins are relatively light, so they're movable because in more extreme temperatures than San Francisco, which has no extremes really, you'll probably want to move your bin. Keeping in the shade most of the time is probably best because again, they don't like light. So while they are covered and there's usually a covering inside the bin, we still want to avoid them getting too much light and too much sun, even when it's not a hot day and they have a lot of sun on, especially because they're usually in a black or a dark colored bin. It's still going to get pretty warm in there, warmer than you think. It's like, sitting in a car on a sunny day. It gets hotter than you want. So keeping them in the shade for most of the time when the sun's out and it's not too cold. And then keeping them by the house can help in the colder months because your house is warm, so it'll keep them warmer. And then of course, bringing them if your garage is more sheltered, and sometimes garages have more extreme temperatures, but if your garage is not one of those, that can offer a little bit more shelter, I would recommend bringing it into a garage or a shed. And then, bringing them into your house really is probably the most consistent temperature. Basement, or, some people keep their worm bin under their kitchen sink, easy access to adding food scraps. But most of the time, I would say only for the extreme temperatures. Most of the time, if you have the space outside, just keep them outside. And I'm sorry, that sounds like a lot of work moving your bin around, but that's the best we can do just to keep them even temperatures on them. So I'm going to continue, and we're going to talk about organic fertilizers. So what's an organic fertilizer? Organic fertilizers are derived from organic matter. So that's mushrooms, manure, compost, kelp, bone, and blood meal. They're not derived from fossil fuels. These synthetic fertilizers that you see out on the shelves are derived from fossil fuels, ammonia, and other products. So these are derived from organic matter, things that are found in nature. And they are often have lower NPK numbers, which that means, just to clarify, the 3 numbers that you see often on the front of the boxes. So on this all-purpose one, it's 462. On the EB Stone, it's also 462. Those are nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium levels, NPK. Those are the elements. And with synthetic fertilizers, those tend to be very high numbers because it's just like, I often compare synthetic fertilizers to be like a Red Bull for your plants. So it's like high intensity nutrients hitting your plants, whereas organics tend to have lower numbers. They're more even. Organics tend to, they also contain micronutrients because they're made out of organic matter that were already made out of micronutrients. They're bringing those nutrients back. So it's not just NPK, it's also boron and magnesium and all of the nutrients that your plants need. And it's also a slower release. You can buy actual slow release like Osmocote, or you can buy one of these organic materials. They are fertilizers. They will release slower to your plants because something we're going to learn next is when you're using organic fertilizers, you're actually feeding the soil. You're not feeding your plant. So you want to feed the soil, feed the organisms in the soil, and then they're going to feed the plant when they need it. So it's just a slower release to your plant. Your plant's not getting injected with nitrogen when it didn't ask for it. Again, so why we should use organic fertilizers, we want to slowly release nutrients over a long period of time. To clarify, when your plant gets injected with, super high nitrogen fertilizer, it's going to shoot out young green growth, where that may sound like a good thing, but if your plant's not ready, it's going to stress out your plant. And also what is attracted to green, new, soft growth? Pests, aphids, thrips, scale, all of these pests love that easy to eat, sugary growth. So instead, when we have slow release fertilizers, your plant is growing at the speed that it's prepared to, and it's not attracting pests by overgrowing its new growth. Again, prevents growth spurts that can attract pests, exactly. And then it increases and feeds the soil microbes because we're feeding the soil in this case, we're not feeding the plant. And it breaks down quickly, so it's not going to run off into local waterways. Sometimes synthetic fertilizers can build up when they run off into local waterways. They can build up and they can cause algae blooms or just unhealthy environments for marine life. And organic fertilizers don't do that. You can never really over fertilize with organic fertilizers because, again, they're feeding the soil and the soil is feeding your plant when it needs it, and it's not going to like overload your plant. This is just to demonstrate how organic fertilizers feed the soil, goes into the organic matter, microorganisms, eats the soil nutrients and gives it to the plant nutrients, whereas synthetic fertilizers feed the plant. Now, what is mulch? I actually get this question a lot. So just to clarify what mulch is really any material spread over the soil surface used as a covering. So it can be made of bark and wood chips. That's probably what you might think of first, but it can also be rubber. There's rubber mulch, gravel, straw, newspaper, oyster shells, leaves, lawn clippings, and landscape fabric, and other things can all be used as a mulch. If it's spread over the soil surface to protect the soil, then it's called mulch. What we're going to talk about today is mostly organic mulch because that has different characteristics than, say, a rubber mulch. So bark, wood chips, straw, really kind of newspaper, all of these things will help your soil as well. So what mulch does, it protects the soil. It's like a nice blanket over soil to keep it insulated, so it keeps it cool in the summer and warm in the winter, so that keeps your plant roots at a nice even temperature. It conserves the water and reduces evaporation, so as the covering on the soil, the water that's maybe escaping the soil can't evaporate as fast. It feeds the soil organisms, so when you're using organic mulch, it does get broken down over time, but that's good. It's feeding the organisms in the soil. And it keeps weeds from sprouting and growing. This is a lot of reason why people do use mulch. This is really probably one of the main reasons, because it protects or it fights weeds by just covering them, keeping them from germinating. And then it creates habitat for beneficial insects. So especially that chunky mulch can actually act like as a little condo for your beneficial insects. And it reduces soil compaction and erosion by keeping the soil in place and protected. And this is what I mentioned quickly earlier. Sheet mulching is a really great tool for a few reasons. So it's often used for getting rid of a lawn because you can just layer cardboard. What sheet mulching is, it's layering cardboard, like 4+ layers of cardboard over a surface and then covering it with mulch, an organic mulch. So it's used to get rid of lawns. So you can just put the cardboard right over your lawn, cover it with mulch, and then within a season or so, you'll be able to plant there, and it will turn your lawn into nice fertile soil. You can also get rid of a large area of weeds this way. I did this in my yard just this summer because I know I'm getting oxalis. I already have oxalis in my yard. So I put 4 layers of cardboard down and then 4 inches of mulch on top of that. And so far so good with the oxalis, although some are popping up on the edge, but it's really doing a great job. And the next season, I'll probably add more mulch just to reinforce it because it does break down. This is also how I mentioned it prepares immature soil. That's another word for dead or lifeless, but we're going to use the word immature soil for planting, for future planting. So if you have a large area that you want to regenerate the soil to plant in it soon, but it's not really ready yet, what you can do if you do want to wait a little bit, give it some time, this is a great way to do that. Layer compost down, layer cardboard. You can do layer, it's called, sometimes sheet mulching is called lasagna mulching because it's like layers on layers. So you can do compost, cardboard, and then mulch on top, and it all break down in a season, especially during the rainy season. And then at the end, you'll have really rich, beautiful soil for a future planting. It also, as I said, it defends against tough weeds. So lots of cardboard layered will keep the weeds down. You might have to redo it a couple seasons to really get rid of those weeds. But it will be very helpful without having to pull all the weeds. And then, as I said, it breaks down, feeding the soil over time because it is carbon material. Now, water. So we talked about compost, we've talked about fertilizer, and we've talked about mulch, but none of these are going to help if we don't have the final part of the equation, which is water. Healthy soil requires water, and healthy plants require water in a nice, consistent way. And so what I want to just focus on is that when we're watering our plants, we want to just keep in mind that we're not just watering the plants and the roots of that plant, we're watering all the soil organisms that also live in that soil. So just keep that in mind. Something Suzanne reminded me of the other day is that 80% of the life in your garden is actually below the soil surface. So just really keep that in mind when you're doing all these things, not just watering, but especially watering. This is the reason why we want to water deeply and infrequently. So when we water, we want to make sure that the water is going nice and deep down into the soil, which will help your plant because the roots will go deep down following that water, and it will create a sturdier plant. But it'll also feed the soil organisms that are not just on the top 3 inches of the soil. It'll feed the whole, the life that's all in your root zone and beyond. Also to expand the watering of your plants, so focus water at the drip line of the trees. I explained this before. It's the outer edge of where the the branches are. That's the drip line. So you really want water all the way out there. We're not focusing water at the crown of the plant, which is where the trunk or the stem meets the soil. That's the crown. We don't want water there because that will cause rot, and it won't provide the roots the water it needs. So we really want to supply water to the whole root zone. So focus water out to the drip line. Remember that now, because we really haven't gotten too much rain yet, so hopefully it'll come. Now is still the best time to plant because new plants need more water. So planting now when the winter rains are going to come and really give your soil a nice soaking. It's basically free irrigation for you, and it's really going to draw your plant roots down deep and have a sturdier plant by summer. And then consider drip irrigation for consistent, efficient, localized watering. Because again, consistent watering, having your plants get water when it needs it and not too much, too little, will prevent a stressed out plant. And a stressed out plant invites pests. So to avoid that, we have our consistent watering, and our healthy soil will be feeding the water to the plant when it needs it. A few of you, if you were at the presentation last week, Suzanne probably shared this image with you. It's just another way to demonstrate the importance of watering deeply versus watering infrequently. We don't want the water just at the surface because that's where the roots are going to go. We want the roots deep down. So bringing it home, when you increase the health of your soil, you're reducing pest problems. So healthy soil equals healthy plants equals less pest problems. And then less pesticide usage, which is what we're all about here at Our Water, Our World. We just want to avoid the pesticides at all costs. So healthy soil fights pathogens, and the healthy soil organisms fight pathogens and bad bacteria in the soil, protecting your plants. Healthy soil feeds plants the diverse nutrients that it needs when it needs it for steady growth and a less stressed out plant. Healthy soil absorbs and stores water to deliver it to the plants when they need it, also for steady growth and no stress. And overall, healthy soil just grows a sturdy plant that won't require chemical fertilizers or pesticides. Healthy plants can just endure pest problems better if they do arise. I know I can't talk about composting and soil health without touching on something that's just near and dear to my heart. I get very excited about it. We're going to end on a hopeful note, hopefully, but looking a little bit, taking a step back and looking at a bigger picture beyond the garden. So another reason that composting is so wonderful that I didn't discuss earlier, besides the benefits to soil, is that composting reduces organic waste. In the United States, about a third of all waste is food and organic waste, and most of it is sent to the landfill. Only 5% of organic waste is composted in the United States. And in the landfill, organic waste produces methane because in the landfill, there's no life, there's no air, and so organic waste can't decompose like it can in your compost pile or on the forest floor. It just kind of sits, it's trapped usually in plastic or underneath something, and it sits and it rots. And rotting produces methane, and methane is 20 to 70 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. According to Project Drawdown, which is a project that studies climate solutions, wasted food is responsible for 8% of global emissions. And when we're talking about wasted food, we're not just talking about the food scraps that we don't use. We're talking about the land, the water, the labor, the energy, all of the inputs that go into producing food, and all of the energy that goes into processing, transporting, preparing, storing, and disposing of the food as well. And then when we focus on composting at home, both in our green bins and in our backyard bins, our worm bins, we're reducing waste and we're reducing emissions. And then soil health is actually seen, it's getting a lot of notoriety lately because it's actually a potential climate solution in our climate crisis. And this is for a few reasons, because healthy soil, through the process of photosynthesis that I described earlier, it's drawing carbon dioxide out of the air and it's pumping it down into the carbon into the soil. Now, carbon itself isn't bad. It's really all about the balance. So carbon dioxide and carbon in the air is not good for the environment. It creates, it's a greenhouse gas, it warms our planet. But if we pump it down into the soil, that just builds healthy soil. That's good for the soil, and that's carbon is good in the soil. So sequestering it in the soil organisms, both the living and the dead soil organisms, that's where we want our carbon to be. By reducing our use of chemical inputs like fertilizer and pesticides, we're reducing our usage of fossil fuels. And healthy soil builds resilience against drought and flood. So as I mentioned before, healthy soil is like a sponge. It has pores for water to infiltrate. So in a flood situation or a storm event, water can really infiltrate the soil deep down and be stored there. So this, and instead of, as opposed to just running off into waterways, and that will help against drought periods, especially in California when we just have drought in the summer. That stored water will feed the soil organisms throughout the year or during drought periods. This also leads to protecting against soil desertification and erosion. So keeping the soil alive, even in periods of drought, will prevent against soil desertification, which is the process in which soil basically when soil is consistently dry, lifeless, it's like a downward spiral into turning into a desert. And then erosion. So that sticky quality to healthy soil keeps the soil particles in place. So it's can protect itself against wind blowing off the soil particles, water taking the soil particles away, protecting against erosion. And then lastly, I already touched on this a little bit, but healthy soil reduces stormwater runoff and filters out pollution. Because that spongy quality, stormwater is able to absorb into the soil as opposed to running into our waterways and bringing the pollution with it. And then once it hits our soil, it's filtered out through that Brita filter-like quality of the soil. And so when it hits the aquifers deep down, it's cleaner. Compost actually can filter out stormwater pollutants by 60 to 95%. So on that slightly, hopefully hopeful note, I'm going to end it, and I'm going to say thank you again to Sloat Gardens, and thank you everyone for being here and listening.
Wonderful, Charlotte. I learned so much. What a fantastic program. Thank you. And we do have a lot of questions. So one question that has come up is, can you explain a little bit of what anaerobic is, and can you correct it? Like once your compost has gone anaerobic, is it just a lost cause?
Thanks for that question. I'm embarrassed that I probably didn't define what anaerobic means. So anaerobic means that there's lack of oxygen. So backyard composting is usually an aerobic process, meaning there is oxygen and we're welcoming oxygen by turning the pile and making sure that there's space for the water or air to infiltrate. Anaerobic means there's no oxygen, and that usually means rot. So that's what we don't want, like what happens in the landfill. So to correct it, you can correct it. It's not like, oh, well, throw the whole thing out. You can correct it in most cases. You can add carbon materials, which are the dryer, the leaves, the branches, the sawdust, the newspaper. That can correct it because that stuff kind of opens up the material for air to infiltrate, absorbs the water more. You can turn it, again, adding air. And then I guess those would be the two things, adding carbon and turning it will correct it. If it's too far gone, if you've left it for 6 months and you come back and your whole pile is just an anaerobic mess, that might be a little too late. But if you're consistently checking on your pile, you should be able to correct it pretty easily.
Okay, beautiful. And then there's a couple questions about the worm bin. Um, One question is do you add more bedding when, because the bedding kind of gets decomposed, they kind of chew through it. Do we add more? Another question is, what are the different layers for the worm bin? What are the layers? What's the type? I think there might be a little bit of a, I'm not sure if they're thinking layers from like the 3-bin system. I'm not 100% sure. But yeah, it's kind of the bedding and the layers.
So let's see, I'll start with the layers. The layers, that's a good question. So there's probably a few ways you could use a worm bin. Traditionally, or the way I learned how, so I'll just share that, is where you start with one layer. So you put the bedding down, you add your food, you add your worms, and then you let the worms eat the food for months and months. And then once they're going to continue to just build, it's going to build up, it's going to get quite full because the castings are there, and there's going to be more worms because they're going to keep reproducing. And then once it's full, you can decide, you're like, okay, this layer is full, I'm done, I'm going to just let them finish. So you stop feeding them for a little while, a couple weeks, maybe a month or two. Stop feeding them, let them really finish that material so that it looks unrecognizable, and then you can move into a new layer. So we use our layers really to help one layer finish and start anew. So it's really just like to keep the process going. So when that one's, maybe your top layer is almost done, most materials are unrecognizable, start feeding them on another layer, adding the bedding again, the either lower, honestly, I'm not so sure if it's the lower level or the upper level. I think worms can move in either direction. So I don't know if it actually matters too much. I think I've done both. So just start feeding them with new fresh bedding on another layer, and the worms are going to travel down into that layer, and they'll move away from your more finished layer. So that's really how we use the layers. You can, if you're like have a ton of worms, you can have 2 active layers. It's just and then add a third layer to draw them out when one's done. But it's really just about it's just helpful to have one kind of almost finished and one starting, just to help the drawing out for when you're harvesting your castings. And then the question about bedding, you do want to continue to add bedding. It's not like crucial. You're not going to kill your worms if you forget to add bedding. I honestly forget to add bedding a lot. I just add food, but it's really just about balancing. They do want that carbon material in there as well. Making sure it's moist, always making sure your bedding is moist. I would have to refer to a book on this one, but honestly, adding bedding every 2 months or so seems appropriate to me. It's really just to balance out your food scraps.
Awesome. I have to apologize to everyone that's still on. If we're not getting to your question, I really apologize, because similar to last week, we have a lot of questions and I can see how it's a little challenging. So another question that's come up, actually quite a few people are asking about coffee grounds and eggshells. I know you already kind of answered the eggshell question, but there are these ideas out there that adding coffee grounds is really good. Another question that kind of goes along with that is ash. So wood ash. Now, not exact biochar, but let's just talk about wood ash from, the barbecue or the fireplace. If you could address those two, that would be really helpful.
Well, let me start with the coffee grounds because I know more about that. I actually have heard of adding coffee grounds to a 3-bin system, although I know I said don't use food. Sometimes I contradict myself. It's not a perfect science. So I have heard of adding coffee grounds to a 3-bin system, definitely to a single bin system, and definitely to a worm bin. Worms really like coffee grounds. again. With all the systems though, you do want to make sure that you're not overloading it. Worms like us, they need a diverse diet. Sorry, blanking on the word. They do need a diverse diet. So you have too much coffee grounds, that's just going to be too acidic for them. But you can definitely use plenty of coffee grounds mixed in with the food scraps. And with your single bin and your worm 3-bin system, coffee grounds are high in nitrogen. So really you just want to make sure that you're balancing it when you do add it, because I did mention that 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. It's really just a slippery slope for adding too much nitrogen, because there are so much materials that are high in nitrogen, like coffee grounds, grass clippings, fresh green leaves. It's really easy to add that stuff. So when you do add it, you just really want to make sure you're balancing it with an equal amount of carbon. But coffee grounds can be a good inoculation with bacteria as well. Ash. I don't know a ton about ash. I assume it's a brown because it's a dry material. But I don't know a ton about the ratio. I would definitely, the Rodale Book of Composting has a amazing breakdown of so many different kinds of ingredients to put into your compost that has even the ratios of carbon to nitrogen in each one. So I would definitely read up on it. I definitely don't put your charcoal briquettes from your charcoal grill in the compost. I think those have some chemicals in them that we don't want in our compost. But wood, ash, I'm gonna say I think it's okay to add as a carbon, but I would check and I will check as well.
What I know about ash is that it's very alkaline. So again, like Charlotte just mentioned, we don't want to overdo any one thing. So balance, but the Rodale's compost book is amazing. And I think using a little bit of ash is okay, but you really want to be mindful not to overdo it. There was a couple questions about, can you add organic fertilizer into the compost? If you're composting, if you're amending the soil in the garden with compost, do you also need to fertilize those plants? So I'll put those two questions together for you.
I've never heard of adding fertilizer to compost, like to the compost pile. I don't think I would recommend that. It doesn't seem to be necessary. But I would say that yes, if you are amending your bed. Sorry, my dog is probably going to bark in a second. I apologize in advance. If you're adding compost, you're amending your beds with compost, adding fertilizer is a good idea. Start with an all-purpose, or if you have a more specific plant like citrus or blueberry, or azaleas, they do have specific fertilizers for that. But yeah, it's just giving your plants really a leg up when they start. And as I said, you can't over fertilize with organic fertilizers, because your plants are being delivered the nutrients they need. They're not just being force fed the nutrients. I will say I shout out to EB Stone Sure Start. I do use that a lot when I'm amending, especially with new plants. It just gives them a little extra boost, and it's formulated for new plants as well.
Okay, super. There's another few questions about how much compost do we put in the soil, or if they've got containers, how much compost to put into the soil.
That's a good question. I've had that question before. It comes up a lot. So when you're adding to like a bed, I would add like 2 or 3 inches. Let's layer 2 or 3 inches on top and then dig it in. For pots, it's a little bit trickier, but think about how what I said, the soil components are, 5 to 10 or 10% is really healthy soil. So if you have a pot, think about 10% of that should be compost. So I can't do the math, but just try to think about that. So if you have like a gallon sized pot, maybe like a cup or two of compost mixed in. You don't want to plant, you never want to plant plants just in compost. They need that mineral material also. So really it's more mineral material than compost. I hope I didn't just confuse people with that.
No, that was great. There is another question that's being asked about the worm compost. And the question is asking, is that compost too hot to apply straight to the soil? Can you just talk about address worm compost versus a thermal composting system, and with the thermal composting system, when it's okay to put the compost out into the garden?
I think you're referring to like if it's finished or not. So when we're doing the thermal compost, we want to make sure that the compost comes down to air temperature before we put it in the garden. If it's at like still like 80, 90 degrees, it's still not finished. So we want to wait till it's air temperature before we use it. And then the worm compost, that's a really good question. So worm compost is a little different than thermal compost, though it can be used very similarly. When I'm using worm compost, I would use less of it because it's so nutrient dense. And it has a little bit different characteristics for the soil, but not enough to really go into right now. But I would say if you're using worm composting, think of it more as a fertilizer than a compost. So you're not putting 3 inches of it on top of your garden beds and mixing it in. Maybe use a ½ inch to an inch and then mix it in because it's just so nutrient dense. You can also water it down a little bit. That does get tricky with city water and all the compost tea talk, but you can water it down a little bit and then like sprinkle it into your soil also.
And then one question that came up is this person has a decomposed granite walkway and was wondering if they put layer of sheet mulch on top of that, will that regenerate the soil? Can you answer that?
Decomposed granite's probably not going to break down. That's just too much mineral material. They could remove as much as possible. And then if they have a really, sheet mulch the heck out of it, they'll have a couple of inches of nice topsoil, but I don't think it's going to be enough. It's not going to be enough to regenerate the decomposed granite.
And then there's a question, why red wiggler worms? They get a ton of worms in their passive compost pile that include all my vegan kitchen, the passive gets vegan kitchen waste. It doesn't smell. So they're pretty sure it doesn't go anaerobic. But you've mentioned red wigglers for the worm bin. Is there something important about the red wigglers?
I'm like pulling out this book that's on your resource guide right here. It has a chapter on why I should use those. They're like the most efficient, I think, at breaking down material. They do talk about night crawlers and other earthworms in this book. I've just have heard those are like the most efficient. They live in the conditions better. They eat those scraps better. That's really all I can say about that. And that's all they sell, I think. Actually, no, well, you can buy night crawlers, but they're for like fishing. I would start with those.
Okay, and to expand on this question, I'll just answer. He said, should I be blocking the worms from coming up into my passive bin? No, let those worms get in that passive bin. The passive bin is a cool composting system. So you're going to see a lot of worms and other little, critters, then they're helping with the decomposition. Quickly, we'll ask one more question, but I just want to, I know I can answer a couple of these. Someone asked about colored mulch, and I want to say those colored dyed mulches, such as like the red mulch or the colored black mulch, that's food coloring. That's food-based dyes, so they are not toxic to the soil or your garden. However, be mindful they can leach a little bit. So if it's near like a porous walkway, such as like concrete, that coloring can stain. And then another question that was asked was like different types of materials, like grape leaves from a vineyard or like oak leaves. Can these
Sorry, I'm going to mute myself.
can these things, can oak leaves, grape leaves, and can they be used inside a composting system? Or is there anything that any type of materials from the garden that we should really avoid putting in the composting system? And I'm going to let you decide if you want to talk about the thermal compost or passive compost.
Sorry, I think I heard that question. My dog was barking at the neighbor.
That makes sense. So the questions were, can I use grape leaves from the vineyard, oak leaves from my garden? Can those go in the compost? Oh, and my other part of that question is there anything we should really not put in the compost that is coming from the garden, other than, what you've already discussed?
Okay. Yeah. So the oak leaves, they just take a very long time to break down. So I would just either shred them quick first, but they can go in the compost, I believe. And Suzanne can correct me if I'm wrong, because I think I've had this question before. And grape leaves, I believe they are fine. I don't know anything special about grape leaves that would prohibit them from going to the compost. Again, we want a diverse compost bin though. So if it's all grape leaves, you're going to have more difficulty breaking things down because there's just not as much diversity, and the compost that comes out of it is also going to be less nutritious if it only has so few materials going in. As for things to avoid, really thick branches, as I mentioned, things that are not going to break down quickly. And then anything that's diseased. So if you're pruning off diseased limbs with mold, powdery mildew, things like that, you want to keep those out of any compost bin. Weeds as well, keep those out. Other things would probably have to be on a very specific case-by-case basis.
Okay, terrific. And then, gosh, I'm sorry. I just got a little bit thrown off. One thing I wanted to add was, in regards to the grape leaves, something that comes up is, how were those grape leaves treated throughout the year? Are they being sprayed with a lot of pesticides? So that's something else I would like to avoid. I don't want to put materials in my compost bins, especially my worm bin, if I know it's been loaded up with a lot of pesticides. Someone else has asked about leaves with peach leaf curl. Absolutely do not go in the compost. And something that Charlotte mentioned earlier in the program about weeds, and she said use caution. The reason why is because we don't typically encourage people to put weeds or anything with pathogens, diseased leaves and such, like Charlotte just mentioned, in the home composting systems, because we can't really manage the composting systems in the same way they do at commercial composting systems. The commercial composting sites are able to keep the temperatures at that like 160 very regular, even 160 temperatures for 10 days straight. And that's what is required to kill off these pathogens, kill weed seeds. So because we're not really able to manage that in our home systems, unless you're super advanced composter, that's why we just encourage people not to put those types of materials in there. I know that there are so many other questions that have been asked. Some people have been asking about where can you get free compost. Please check out your local city. And I know, Charlotte, you had mentioned there are some resources like SF Environment.
SF, well, if you want free mulch, and I think they do have compost, but again, I don't know the quality of the compost. If you're in San Francisco, in the Bayview, there's SF Green Waste, where you can just go and load up your truck or your trunk full of all the free mulch that you want. It's not very good quality. I will say it's not very pretty, but it's free.
Yeah. And then I know that someone else asked the question, the difference between buying bags of compost versus making it your home. Some people don't have the luxury of making compost at home. So that's why there's these other resources such as your city, the free compost or the free mulch that comes from the city on occasion. Buying bag material, places like Slope, they bring in the highest quality from our local really good vendors. So, if you can't make it at home, you can buy it and it's going to do the trick. And a lot of people were asking, and I think we'll close with this one. People were asking about different types of manures. So goat manure, is that okay? Are there any carnivorous animals that we can use their manures, or is it always just going to be vegetarian?
I'm fairly certain the goat is fine. I don't totally, I think goats are vegetarian.
Mhm.
Um, Chickens are not vegetarian. Those are omnivores, as are ducks, and I don't know what pigeons eat. But so it's not strictly vegetarian. But if it's a what are those called? Ruminant, I guess that's good. And yeah, goat I've never heard of, but it seems fine. I wouldn't use pig because I don't really know how the manure is, but they eat all kinds of crazy things. So I wouldn't use pig manure. Stick to if it's not a poultry, I would stick to the vegetarian um, creature manure. I hope that's clear enough.
Well, Charlotte, I know that some of the questions maybe did not get significant answers, and I apologize, but you can certainly reach out to Charlotte. You can reach out to me, and you can reach out to Jen, and we'll get your questions answered. But a lot of people are just saying thank you so much, Charlotte. Such an amazing program, so informative. We have a lot of eager composters right now because you have provided everyone with a lot of inspiration for getting out in the garden, getting that compost in the soil so that they can, increase the health and have fun and all of that. So Charlotte, thank you.
Thanks everyone for being here.
Yes, I agree fully. I also learned a ton. And so that was really awesome. And I do want to share, just based on the poll, that it looks like the majority of people hadn't composted before. And so I can only imagine that they're completely inspired and encouraged by your presentation. So I think that's super awesome.
Yay.
I thank you both for being here. I think this was another successful webinar, and I'm super happy, and I'm looking forward to future classes with both of you. And for everyone else, just look on our website for classes that we have coming up. And we're just kind of getting this whole thing rolling. So like I said before, any feedback that you have for me, I welcome and I encourage, because more than anything, we want to make this a valuable experience for you and effective and whatnot. So please feel free to email me. And like Suzanne said, all three of us are available for any follow-up questions that we didn't address. So it's a nice day out in the bay. I hope everybody gets out in their garden and enjoys this lovely weather. Thanks again for joining us. Have a good day.
Thank you.